So good afternoon and welcome, everyone. It's good to see so many of you here today, as UI and the MENA program have a public seminar on the socioeconomic drivers of protest in the Middle East and North Africa region. We thought that this is still a very timely topic. I mean, there was a lot of talk at the beginning of this year of it being the 10-year anniversary of the 2011 Arab uprisings. And we all know that this was a wave of events that went a long way to briefly reshuffle the status quo in a lot of countries across the region. What's still very interesting to look at is that there are still a lot of events unfolding, and a lot of the dynamics that were behind the uprisings are still very much driving socioeconomic protest in the region today. So today we will be focusing on that. We have three speakers with us. We have Linda Khatib, who's the director of the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House. We have Youssef Sharif, who's the director at the Columbia Global Center in Tunis. And then we have our very own Linda El Naggar, who's an analyst at the Middle East and North Africa program here at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. So what we're trying to do today with the speakers is sort of give a comparative view of what's happening in the region in terms of protest and uprisings in three different countries, these being Tunisia, Lebanon, and Algeria. And because there is so much to cover and there are so many forces that are at play here, I have asked the speakers to focus on three particular themes, these being law and constitutions, economy, and legitimacy. Obviously, there is a lot to cover, but I am sure that there is also going to be a very interesting discussion afterwards. So the way in which we're going to proceed is that each speaker is going to give us an overview of what's going on in the case studies that they're looking at for about 10 minutes, and then we will open the floor up for questions from the public. You can submit your questions either on Facebook Live or through the Q&A tab. And I'm really looking forward to this. I'm sure this is going to be a very interesting and productive discussion. So I think that without further ado, we will begin. So Youssef, if you want to unmute yourself and begin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. Good to be in Stockholm, but from Tunis. I will speak about Tunisia mostly. And actually, the Tunisia I'm talking about today is very different from the Tunisia we used to discuss between January 2011 and July 2021. So in a way, what I used to say just up to 2 months ago was the same for more or less 10 years. And now we're talking about something completely different. Because the situation that was put on motion by the President of the Republic 2 months ago is an unfolding scenario that has put things upside down in the country. I'm asked to develop on three main themes, the constitution, the economy, and the issue of legitimacy. And they are actually well interlinked. But the 7 minutes, the timeline makes this kind of speed dating of socioeconomic drivers of protests a bit hard as an exercise, but I will try. Now, regarding the law and the constitution, perhaps what you've been hearing the most or reading about the most in recent months, if you follow Tunisia, is the freezing and maybe soon the suspension of the constitution. Of course, this is a shocking event in the life of any state. This is something that needs to be addressed both locally and internationally. Moreover, constitution needs to be treated carefully, not written and rewritten every few years following the whims of individuals or groups. Having said that, it doesn't mean that the constitution, this constitution that was widely praised all over the world when it was voted in 2014, it doesn't mean that the constitution was widely respected by those who ruled Tunisia before July 25th, by those who ruled Tunisia in the last 5 years at least. They were not fully respecting it, and the laws were not all of them well implemented. In fact, the constitution of 2014 was written in part by many MPs with no long-term vision and very little popular legitimacy. And I will come back to this point later, the point of legitimacy. But let me now move to the point related to the economy. It's obvious that Tunisia's economic situation deteriorated in the last 10 years, and this has affected most citizens. The pandemic only exacerbated the problems and sent the country to the unknown. But the economic situation was already quite bad. So if we compare where things were in 2010 and where they are today, we'll find that growth went from 3.5% in 2010 to minus 8.6%. We'll find that the government debt to GDP doubled from around 43% to more than 87%. The local currency, the Tunisian dinar, lost half of its value to the US dollar in just a few years. Inflation went from around 4% to more than 6%. Investment is very limited. Unemployment is not going down. It's not going very high, but it's not going down either. And it was already a problem in 2010, and it continues to be. The country keeps borrowing from abroad. And although the overall corruption indicators do not seem catastrophic, again, relatively compared to other countries in the region, Tunisia seems okay. But even though there is a feeling among many Tunisians that corruption is endemic, and living in Tunisia, you feel it. Hence, we see a large chunk of the population for whom democracy is synonymous with state collapse. And by democracy, I mean the concepts of parliament, political parties, elections, political debates, constitution, etc. So if you ask those who went out celebrating the move of the President of the Republic 2 months ago, why they don't like democracy, or why they are celebrating the situation where the parliament is actually put on in the fridge, as we say, they will tell you that, well, this is what democracy means. And as I said, these are the people who celebrated the move of the president and who tell you that whatever happens now, it can't be worse than where they were. And this leads us to, I think, the most important part, which is the issue of legitimacy. So as we see the army encircling the parliament in Tunisia today, and as we live with a president who rule by decrees, and we kind of get used to that in a way, we are tempted to describe the situation in black and white terms, as if the gun carrier is subjecting the pen holder. This is somewhat misleading, because political parties in Tunisia represent only a few handful of partisans. Apart from another party, but even another party proved to be very weak when these events happened. The parliament is home to many MPs who got elected by chance. I mean, not all of them, but many of them, and who are disconnected from their constituencies. The government that ruled Tunisia in the last decade, the governments, not the government, because we had almost one government per year. So these governments, they were mostly the results of under-the-table negotiations that had little to do with the popular vote. So it's people vote, but actually those they voted are not the ones who end up governing, or not always. This is to say that the country was actually facing a major crisis of legitimacy on July 25th, when the president decided to act. Now, does it mean that the president has more legitimacy than those he toppled? Not necessarily. It's true that today the president is extremely popular. But that's because the ruling clique that he sidelined is accused for all the country's wrongs. So what we've seen and what we see today is not necessarily people loving the president or people being on the side of the president, this is not a Khomeini kind of revolution. I mean, the president just 2 or 3 years ago, not many people knew him. He doesn't have a real group around him or a lot of supporters and well-convinced supporters. Also, there is something else that is happening in Tunisia these days. The country, if you were in Tunisia in June or early July, or July actually, you would feel the depression in the country because COVID was creating havoc. There were hundreds of deaths every week, more than 1,000 deaths per week, I think, for a country which is kind of the size of Sweden. And we had no vaccines. So there was no hope, more or less, in June and July in the country. There were funerals after funerals, and that motion seemed to be unable to stop. And then the vaccines came. We can discuss this later, but the vaccines came in late July and August. So now in September, the country is breathing again. So in a way, we are in a state where many people are still very happy. They see hope, and they link this hope to the move of the president. Therefore, the situation is like a honeymoon, but this honeymoon will end sooner or later. And once that honeymoon ends, once the economic realities of the country come to the fore, the president himself will have to confront the fact that he, like those he dismissed, doesn't have any real constituency, and will have to deal with the same issues that those he dismissed had to deal with. And then his legitimacy will also quickly erode. Will he then abide by the people's will and leave if they are out demonstrating? Or will he use the army and the police to stay in power? We don't know. We'll see, actually. That's why Tunisia today needs a national dialogue. Whatever. I mean, that's at least in my opinion, that's the only thing that can be done. I mean, there needs to be dialogue. A dialogue between those who still have some legitimacy among a few constituencies. This means the main labor union, UGTT, the union of the business owners, the UTK, the president himself, another party, which is, even though which proved actually very, very weak, but it still has its grassroots, the major NGOs. These guys need to sit together and find a way out of the current situation. They need to do it today before the floods take them all tomorrow. And I think this is all I had to say. Thank you very much, and we can continue in the discussion.
Thank you, Yusuf. That was super interesting. You really managed to give us a picture of what's going on. And what I think is very interesting is that all of these themes that we're looking at, as you were saying, are deeply interconnected. This is something that that really tells us that you can't just address corruption or address the state of democratic institutions individually, but it seems like there needs to be an intersectional approach to all of this. And we will go back to your final point about the national dialogue, because I think that as a roadmap to move forward, this is something that we all need to keep our eyes on to see if it actually happens and then how it develops. So we will definitely go back to that. So thank you. And Lina, it's really good to see you. It's good that you just managed to join us. So if you're ready, I will give the floor to you now.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much. Sorry for the delay. My calendar had this booked a whole hour in advance. So I thought we're starting in 15 minutes. Anyway, here we are. So first of all, thank you for having me. I've been asked to comment on three major drivers behind protests and mobilization in the region, which can be summarized as law or constitutional factors, economic factors, and the issue of legitimacy. So I'm going to go over these in turn. The first category of, is there a problem with legislation or the constitution across the region that drives people to protest? I will say, if you look at political representation, you will see that quite often, unfortunately, in the region, political representation is a closed space. And it is a closed space when election laws are designed in a way to keep power exclusive. Same thing with the formulas for the distribution of power. Sometimes also they are done in a way that is exclusive. And here we can look at Iraq and Lebanon with their sectarian systems of political representation. to see what I mean by exclusive distribution of power. So when you have these systems in place, you make it very difficult for other voices to be able to be represented. The second point I want to make under the issue of law and constitutions is that, you know what, sometimes actually the constitution is fine, maybe not ideal, but it is possible. But the problem is that constitutions are not implemented. So, for example, in Syria, right now we have a whole committee to revise the constitution as part of the UN-led peace process. But the issues of the conflict in Syria and the reason why people mobilized in the first place are not to do with a bad constitution. They are to do with the performance of the regime. Actually, the constitution that was drafted in Syria, I believe in the 50s, is not so bad, you know, all things considered. So it's about not implementing the rights of citizens that are already in the constitution. Now, the case of Tunisia, I'm not going to talk about because Youssef is the expert here, but obviously here we have a very different take of the constitution's link with mobilization, so I'm not going to talk about that. The second issue is the economy. Now, of course, we know that inequalities, economic inequalities, are a major reason behind protests across the region. We saw this in the Arab uprisings and onwards. And here I want to talk about not just the big economic picture that has to do with inequalities, but also how these inequalities play out horizontally and vertically. So when we talk about horizontal inequalities, we are talking about regional inequalities in a country. So for example, rural versus urban, peripheral areas versus key urban areas. In different countries, these play out differently. So, for example, in Tunisia, you'll see some of the coastal cities being ignored economically, whereas in other countries, the coastal cities tend to be the richer cities. So it varies. However, we're talking about variations across geography. And this is linked to the issue of local governance as well, because sometimes periphery comes with lack of attention to local governance, which means increased inequalities. And then you have the vertical issue, which is when you have elite pacts in charge, where the economic policies developed by these elite pacts serve the elites and not the people, where you have lack of social safety nets by the government, when you have corruption leading to the siphoning of state resources. Lebanon is a key illustration of this right now. So these factors lead to great inequalities between the rulers and the ruled. And no wonder, you know, people mobilize as a result, as we've seen in Lebanon over the past 2 years, although the mobilization is, of course, lessening in terms of street action, but the anger remains at large. The last issue is the issue of legitimacy. And here we have, you know, these examples showing us that very often across the region, we have governments that not just do not represent their citizens at large quite often, but in particular governments that do not allow opposition voices. So you have, even in a situation like Lebanon, where you have consensus supposedly amongst different political parties represented in a government, even though today the situation is changing a bit because some of the political parties from the elites are refusing to be part of the government, yet these governments do not represent opposition voices. They do not represent independent political voices. So they remain very closed. And this leads to the issue of, are these governments then legitimate if they actually do not reflect the diversity out there in society? And of course, these governments end up, as I said before, not delivering to their citizens, which erodes their legitimacy further. And finally, there is lack of accountability for the behavior of these governments, again, by design. So this is my overview with a bit of Lebanon examples thrown in, because I think this is one of the countries that we're going to focus on today. And thank you.
Thank you, Lina. There's so much to pick on in there, like so many different interesting questions. I think like the main thing that your intervention really made me think about is the fact that a lot of this goes back to the idea of the social contract between the state and the citizens, and the fact that the terms of this social contract are either unclear or they're not being met. therefore leading to, long-standing grievances that keep popping up throughout the years because they're never being addressed properly. Or indeed, as Youssef was also saying, with that long-term vision, there is more than just putting a patch or like putting down a fire just to then move on. So this is definitely something that we're going to come back on later in the discussion. So now we're going to move to the case study of Algeria. So Linda, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lucia. It's great to be here. And also very interesting, of course, to hear about the cases of Tunisia and Lebanon, since they do have quite a lot in common in a sense with Algeria, but there are also some differences, which we can maybe discuss later on. So when it comes to the Algerian case, frustration over widespread corruption, a worsening socioeconomic situation, and a sort of out-of-touch political elite is nothing new. It has been going on since the early 2000s and provoked protests. So inspired by their neighbors, Algerians also took to the streets during the so-called Arab Spring of 2011, but never in numbers large enough to cause a proper upheaval. And there are several reasons for this, which I can come back to later on. So the Hirak, which means movement in Arabic, emerged in February 2019 as millions of Algerians mobilized against a fifth presidential term for Abdelaziz Bouteflika. So he had rarely been seen in public since suffering a stroke in 2013, was sitting in a wheelchair, etc. And this provoked large protests, and the mere size of these protests and its peaceful or largely peaceful character made it difficult for the regime to use its traditional repressive and redistributive measures. So instead, the army removed Bouteflika after 20 years in power. However, these protests continued as people called for a civilian state instead of a military one. And apart from a brief pause last year, protests have continued for basically every week up until May, when they were hindered by a massive police presence and widespread repression just prior to the legislative elections in June this year. So that's for a bit of the overview of the Hirak. And now if we go into the legal framework, well, after the ousting of Bouteflika in 2019, presidential elections were organized in December 2019. And they took place against the backdrop of mass protests. What happened was that the elections led to the victory of Abdelmajid Tebboune, who was or is a former housing minister. And he was very much the army's preferred choice, unsurprisingly. And of course, seeking to get back to business as usual, Tebboune introduced a new constitution in late 2020. However, this document ignored protesters' demands, such as a transfer of presidential power, an assurance of judicial independence, and a reinforcement of press freedom and freedom of expression. And I mean, the turnout was like 23% or something. So clearly did not interest the protesters very much. And this became another sort of grievance. And talking about grievances, there are also the economic grievances. So I'll move on to the economy, because a real danger arose in March last year when the oil price completely collapsed. And that was, of course, the stability of the Algerian regime, relying to a great extent on hydrocarbon rents to buy social peace and control the opposition. So now the hydrocarbon sector in Algeria represents around a third of its GDP and almost 95% of its export sector. So this leads then to a very stagnated rentier economy and massive corruption. And the place of corruption in Algerian state is also something I can come back to later. So although the Hirak started mainly as a political campaign in 2019, it has now evolved into an expression of grievances, as mentioned. So we have an unemployment that is up at 14%, a youth unemployment that is up at 29.7%. And this is in a country where 60% of the population is under 30. So this is, of course, quite bad and worrying. And as one sociologist, Nasser Jabi, has put it, there is a junction between the political movement and socioeconomic demands, as is the case in Tunisia and in Lebanon. So this is something we can discuss more further on. So the redistribution of rent in exchange for political inactivity, that is very much part of the social contract in Algeria. But now, with an economy in crisis, it is becoming increasingly difficult for the regime to look after the citizens' interests. And that, of course, leads us up to the third point of legitimacy, that important point. So legislative elections were organized in June this year, and this was simply to appease the protesters. The turnout was historically low at 23%, so clearly marking the lack of legitimacy and also sort of crisis of confidence that characterizes current state-society relations in Algeria. Because, of course, the Hirak is very much a response to a stagnated system of governance known as le pouvoir, so the power. And basically, we have the military who makes up the spine very much. And then we have different branches of patronage networks consisting of politicians, economic elites, state bureaucrats, and of course, the main state party, the National Liberation Front, FLN. So we see a widening gulf between, on the one hand, Algeria's youth, who is immersed in the global internet culture and who is quite individualized, and the ailing generals who are in power. So it is clear that one of the main pillars of the regime, and that is the revolutionary legitimacy of the War of Liberation from 1954 to 1962, is becoming less and less important in Algerian society. And this leads to questions on the regime's long-term survival. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Once again, there is a lot of overlap in between these cases, but also it's interesting to see how very different national contexts also have their own structural grievances that have been long-standing for a very long time. They are very much driving not only what's going on today, but what has been going on for quite a while, as you've all pointed out. Before I abuse my power as moderator to ask you questions to all of you, I just want to remind the audience that they can submit their own question through the Q&A tab, so please feel free to do that. But I want to begin with a question that is directed to all of you. Something that you've all been touching upon, as I was saying earlier, is very much the disintegration of trust, essentially. The fact that citizens not only don't feel represented politically, but they also feel like the government is very much not providing the support, the economic support, but also the security support that they need in order to feel like they are part of the social contract and that they are part of civil institutions. So I just want to get you guys' opinion on whether this is indeed the case in the countries that you're looking at. And if it really is mostly a matter of trust, is it the case that people are seeing protest as the only place in which they can actually advocate for structural changes? And if that is the case, then how do we go about instituting dialogue to indeed move forward? So this is a question to all of you. I will let you choose which one of you wants to go first.
All right, I can start. Sure, it's definitely a question of trust, I'd say. So, I mean, a main reason for why Algerians don't go to the polls is because they know that the elections are rigged. So, yes. And trust is also, of course, connected to corruption. In Algeria, probably as in maybe in Tunisia and Lebanon too, I mean, they call their politicians thieves because they know that there are massive resources that are just, being siphoned out of the country. The problem of trust. So, I mean, as I said, it affects the elections. It is also leading, as you mentioned or suggested, Lucia, leading people out of the streets, since they see that they don't have any other options. But it's also an obstacle to proper organization, because one of the reasons that dialogues have not functioned between the hierarchy and the government is that the hierarchy or the protesters are so afraid of cooptation of the opposition, because this is something that has happened in the past. And they are also they don't have trust in the opposition, so they don't really want to involve any formal parties in this movement. So that is, of course, a major problem. So you have the demonstrations, and then you also have, which I know is an issue in Tunisia as well, the haragas, they are called, so irregular boat migrants. So that's another, when people feel that there are no economic opportunities, we are humiliated, what can we do? Well, some risk their lives and leave by boat. So that's the Algerian case, I'd say.
That's great, thank you. Yusuf, you are muted.
Sorry, I was talking to someone. Of course. The trust thing, and it's good that I'm speaking right after Linda, because in neighboring Tunisia, which is a democracy, or which was a democracy, I don't know where we are now exactly, but at least in neighboring Tunisia, which is a democracy, in theory, people don't need to go to the street and they have elections. But you ask Tunisians, they will tell you, no, we vote or we don't vote, it's the same thing, and it leads nowhere. Even though they actually voted for the guy who is now changing everything. So it's thanks to democracy that the current president is president of the republic and not just some professor in a local school. So actually democracy can lead to major changes. But it's true that, we'll see whether he will be able to do this or whether to do what he wants to do, which is actually changing the political system and, according to him, giving more representation to the citizens, etc., etc. We'll see whether he will be able to do it or whether the other institutions institutions and groups and cartels, or however we call them, will constrain his work and actually prove what the citizens were saying, that whatever happens, there are these groups that actually control things in the country, and that whatever you do, you cannot really change things. And therefore, in the case of Tunisia, even though we had democracy, but we had always people demonstrating. In the last 10 years, we've had thousands of protests, even, of course, before than what we had during dictatorship, because it was not allowed during dictatorship to protest as much as they can do now. But we have a lot of protests, and people do not see themselves represented in parliament and in the political affairs of the country. So we're talking about trust and how to regain trust. It's really a difficult question. And again, it's related to what we see all over the region and all over the world. I mean, look at what happened in the US with Donald Trump. The same feelings, you will find them among the American citizen living in the Bible Belt and the Tunisian living in Kasserine and in other places outside of the capital, or inside the capital. For this. So the issue of trust is a global thing, but I think no one has a clear answer. And that's why something like a national dialogue, whatever it is always better than actually leaving it open and just waiting for everything to collapse because people do not feel represented.
Okay, I guess that leaves it up to me to talk about the wonderful case of Lebanon. I think the explosion of last year is a very illustrative case of the tragedy that is happening in the country in terms of citizen-state trust. As you probably know, the explosion happened and the government at the time said to people that within a matter of days, there would be an investigation of the circumstances around the explosion. More than a year has passed, and not only has no such investigation happened, but just this week, the former Minister of Interior in Lebanon managed to block the appointment, basically, or the measures that would have allowed one of the judges in Lebanon to actually investigate the case. So the judge was removed from investigating the case. And this is the second judge that is removed by basically the political establishment. So this shows how in Lebanon, not only is there no trust when it comes to the citizens in the government because the government blatantly lies, but also that the judiciary is not independent. Because even when you have an independent voice within the judiciary, like this judge, Tariq Bitar, the system around the judiciary allows the political establishment to manipulate it or actually use mechanisms that are already part of the system in order to influence the judiciary. So here we're talking about two different kinds of corruption that are happening in Lebanon at once. One is the ability of the political elites to manipulate the system, and the second is systemic corruption, so that the system itself is designed to allow corruption to happen. And this is very different from, people in power are just siphoning off state resources, for instance. So often when we think of corruption, we think of that, but we're talking here systemic corruption. So this does not, of course, bode well for citizen trust at all, because the citizens cannot have recourse to the law. Even their elected representatives basically do not attend to their needs. And so there is a complete breakdown of citizen-state trust. And in some ways, this ends up perpetuating the system because, sadly, just for the sake of survival, the people in Lebanon in general have had to make do with initiatives that they start or rely on social services provided by international organizations or rely on civil society initiatives to perform the roles that should be performed by the state. And so here we have a kind of these make-do measures kind of allowing people to survive. But at the same time, the system in place takes advantage of this to continue to be complacent. So it's unfortunately a self-perpetuating vicious circle.
Yes, thank you. You're all painting a rather bleak picture, but again, I think that the overlapping here is very interesting. And it's also like picking up on something that Linda mentioned during her talk, is like we are looking at a region and at countries that have an incredibly young population. So this is something that really requires the long-term vision that Youssef was also talking about. Like there needs to be a roadmap. There needs to be some sort of like long-term plan of how and when this is going to get solved, which is kind of a very nice segue into some of the questions that we have from the public. So I will start with you, Youssef. There are a few questions about the constitution, especially picking up on something that you also mentioned, the fact that the Tunisian constitution was hailed internationally when it was first written because of, its attention to climate change and racism and equalities and all of these very important issues. So why would you say that it lacks long-term vision in that sense? And then for Linda, we have a question about Algeria, and we were wondering whether you could say something about trust within the Al Iraq movement. So what is kind of the situation there? Is there dialogue taking place internally? And for you, Lina, looking at Lebanon, something that I'm wondering is what about the role of non-state actors? Because this is something that obviously being a sectarian system, there's a lot of talk about it. Is the situation giving more power to specific non-state actors? And if that is the case, is that even further deepening social inequalities between communities in Lebanon? So we'll start with Youssef, then Linda, and then we'll go back to you, Lina.
Thank you for the question, and allow me to maybe correct myself. What I meant by lack of vision was not about, I was not talking about the constitution, but about some of the MPs who wrote the constitution. Because the elections and the different elections in Tunisia are such that a number of candidates are actually picked in the last moment by either political parties or by political movements or themselves. They go and present and run for elections without where you have people who maybe 1 year or even 6 months before those elections, they had nothing to do with politics and with so when they run, it's not necessarily with a vision for the country or for their constituency. It's with very broad ideas and at the very last minute. And so that's why they change parties or positions very quickly once they're elected. And we see a lot of scenes in the parliament. We've seen a lot of scenes in the parliament that we didn't really understand. So this is what I meant. Now, speaking about the constitution, it's true that as a constitution, it has a lot of progressive points. It was studied and restudied and received a lot of comments by Tunisia's most knowledgeable constitutional experts and by different institutions across the world, because of the freedoms that we had in Tunisia in the last 10 years. I think everyone everywhere was able to comment on this constitution, be it scholars, PhD researchers, or big NGOs and so on. So this constitution is actually, as a text, it's something very progressive. But if you ask Tunisians, what is your constitution about? Not all of them are involved. Not all of them feel represented and feel involved. Their MPs didn't really work on disseminating the information about what was being written, and the discussions around the constitution was actually at the parliament, of course, among a few MPs, but it didn't really reach the majority of the population. So when we say that this constitution is representative of the majority of the population because it was voted by, I don't know how many hundred MPs, that's only partly true, because these MPs themselves, they do not represent all the constituencies. So a large group of the population do not feel represented by these MPs, and they do not feel that the constitution represents them.
All right, so to Algeria then, and the matter of trust within Iraq, which is of course a very relevant topic, because it's one of the reasons for why mobilization was different now and from 2019 in comparison to in the Arab Spring. So during the Arab Spring, for example, there was no cross-ideological coalition between seculars and those with Islamist leanings. And this was, or is said to be because of the the ongoing memories of the violent civil war that took place during the 90s. However, now, from 2019 with Iraq, there has been a cross-ideological coalition since the presence of the youth is very strong and they don't have any memories of this war. And that has really been, one of the strengths within the Iraq and, a major reason for success, I'd say, in mobilization. But there are still, of course, problems since the different leanings and divisions within the movement. So there is regularly conflicts between feminists on the one hand and conservatives on the other. There is also, in some cases, a lack of trust versus Berbers, so the minority group in Algeria. And, when they try to claim their rights, some people will say that, well, it's like a colonial project, like during France, let's not, we need to be united. So these are ongoing issues. And it's definitely one of the reasons for why there is no proper leadership at all. Because, there's simply not enough trust. And as I mentioned before, opposition parties are not trusted, which is, of course, also an obstacle because it makes it more difficult to create a united front. And then I can just add, when it comes to trust towards the state, a major reason for why the lack of trust is also that the Algerian independence is kind of seen as stolen, that it's stolen from the generals that took it, that took power in the 60s, since there were different kind of nationalist movements in the 30s and the 40s. So, yeah, there's a lack of trust on several levels, basically.
Okay, the question of non-state actors is a good one because it flows quite nicely from what I was just saying about how people have to go outside of state institutions to get their needs met, for instance. And here is where, especially in Lebanon, in the case of Hezbollah, this has played right into the hands of the group. Because here we have a group that has a political model built on also having a social services kind of organization built into the model of the political party. And of course, other ruling political parties in Lebanon do the same thing to various degrees. So for example, you will find in Lebanon so-called medical charities that are affiliated with this political party or that, and parties, because of the patronage system, also operate on the basis of trying to meet some people's needs. But the level at which Hezbollah does this is greater. But the distribution of rents, obviously, in all those cases, is targeting the particular constituents of each party. So it's not like any of those parties is really serving the citizens at large in the country. These social services and distribution of goods are only used to keep the constituents loyal in a patron-client fashion. So here we have Hezbollah as a non-state actor in a country that is witnessing the most severe economic crisis of its modern history. The party is not a party with an economic vision for Lebanon. One thing I noticed is the shift that the party has taken from in 2019 talking about reform quite openly to now in 2021 talking about the delivery of basic goods, such as this whole hoo-ha around few trucks of diesel that the party managed to smuggle into Lebanon. So here we have a non-state actor that is taking advantage of this domino effect of the lack of accountability in Lebanon, the political system leading to an economic crisis, leading to a party using very few, if you think about it, resources in order to present itself as a provider when the state is not able to. So here we also have the dynamic of the non-state actor basically taking advantage of the weakness of the state as well. So in a way, it is in Hezbollah's interest for the state in Lebanon to remain weak, because then Hezbollah can say, see, the state didn't deliver, but we can. And this is something I wrote about in a paper for Chatham House that was published in late June about Hezbollah's ability to control the levers of the state. So here we have, again, another self-perpetuating system in place. So it's the kind of flip side of what I talked about earlier, the self-perpetuating system from the point of view of the citizens who are left with very few choices. Here we have several choices that the system actually provides for a non-state actor like Hezbollah, that has enough of a regional backing from Iran, enough of a constituency in Lebanon, and enough weapons to put all these together in order to effectively become the most powerful political actor in Lebanon. And that's why I refer in my paper to Hezbollah as a hybrid actor rather than a non-state actor, because despite all these transgressions, actually, Hezbollah is given legitimacy by the Lebanese state. So it can also get away with a lot of what it's doing because it has this legitimate status. So it's, for example, the bringing of fuel into the country recently, which was Iranian fuel brought into Syria, smuggled into Lebanon rather openly. The Lebanese state obviously said nothing about this, even though technically this is against the law. And that is because actually Hezbollah dominates the Lebanese government. So no wonder it's not, going to be subjected to any measures of accountability. So once again, the system knows how to maintain itself.
Yeah, thank you. And again, we keep coming back in all these cases to the question of legitimacy and to really holds power and accountability even. Who are people meant to hold accountable in terms of meeting daily needs, right? And there's also, I think, a much bigger question in terms of what will this relationship between the state and its citizens look like if in a lot of these cases it wouldn't be about daily survival. And this is also something that probably needs to very much be featured in a center position when we talk about national dialogues and when we talk about, long-term plans to move forward. So we actually have a lot of questions that are coming in now. So I'm trying to handpick them, but hopefully we will have time to go to all of them. This time, I think we will start with you, Linda. There is a question that speaks about the fact that the elephant in the room seems to be the recent death of Bouteflika, which in itself is a symbol of the diminishing salience of the revolutionary legitimacy, right? So the question is about what would contemporary legitimacy look like if this is the context that the events are developing in. For Yusuf, a very similar question to the one that was just asked to Lina. The audience wants to know what has been the role of civil society in a time of low trust for politicians and for democracy in general, really, and what is a constructive way ahead reflecting on this. And then for Lina, I think it was a really great point when you started with a general overview at the beginning when you were pointing out regional inequalities. And I was just wondering whether you can speak a little bit more about the implication of these regional inequalities for political, social, and economic legitimacy across the region as well. So we'll go with Linda, then Lina, and then Yusuf.
All right, thanks for this great question, because Bouteflika sure is the elephant in the room. And of course, this man ruled Algeria for 20 years. Algeria will celebrate its 60th birthday or birthday of independence next year. So he ruled for about a third of the lifetime of the nation state of Algeria. And his legitimacy was very much that of a peacemaker, since he was the one who sort of officially managed to get a stop to the brutal civil war in the 90s through a charter on peace or peace and reconciliation in 2005. So what can the legitimacy look like now? Well, I don't think that it can include any old generals anymore. In a country with such a young population, that is not possible. I mean, as I mentioned, the youth, they don't even remember the Black Decade, the Civil War in the 90s. So they definitely don't remember the War of Independence in the 50s and the 60s. So legitimacy needs to be based on representation. And in that sense, there would need to be someone who is a lot younger, who leads the republic. And of course, I mean, this is linked to, as we've mentioned, it's linked to trust. It's linked to corruption. So, of course, it's a question of who is the figure, the representative of the state, but also to diversify the economy, basically, because right now, well, with a rentier state, it will just, it will keep on. It's kind of, as Lina mentioned for Lebanon, it's a vicious circle of corruption. And as long as this vicious circle goes on, there is no legitimacy, even if there would be a younger person. So someone who's more representative and solving the endemic corruption that is a case in Algeria as well.
Okay, I believe I'm next this time. Lucia, yeah, okay. And I think the question was linking regional inequalities with, is it accountability or trust? What exactly is the angle?
It was linking to all of the things that we're talking about. So how are regional inequalities actually being reflected in the situations that we're looking at in socioeconomic grievances? Is this something that is playing a role in exacerbating the situation or not?
Yeah. I mean, sadly, the short answer is yes, because the regional inequalities play out more prominently and make the systemic problems, play out more prominently. So, for example, in Lebanon, the north of Lebanon is actually the poorest region in the country, the region of Akkar. It's a mainly agricultural region, and yet the government has not really implemented any agricultural development plan or an industry kind of development plan for that region. And ironically, the area in the north in Lebanon has produced several millionaires and billionaires in Lebanon, amongst whom is the current prime minister of Lebanon. So the area is not without potential entrepreneurs who could have had private initiatives to develop the area, but they have ignored it as well. So it's not just state negligence, it's also the lack of alternatives. I'm not going to go into the motivations, but the key thing is that area is very rural. And unfortunately, in Lebanon, we see this across the board, that these rural areas tend to be ignored. And so when last year, especially Lebanon entered lockdown because of the COVID crisis, it became so apparent that the government does not have any social safety nets that could compensate daily laborers in particular. And that area of Lebanon has a very high percentage of people who rely on daily labor for survival. And when the country was completely shut, the government gave them nothing. This is where Lebanon saw a new wave of protests in that region, more so than anywhere else. So sometimes, yes, the inequalities that lead to mobilization can very much be seen in very, very clearly defined areas. And of course, the grievances that the people there were airing in Lebanon echo what other Lebanese were saying, but the day-to-day, if you like, living of these inequalities was more pronounced. So absolutely, I think the issue of regional equalities is often not given the attention it deserves. And also linked to this, the reform usually comes in the form of talking about decentralization, which in a country like Lebanon becomes a sensitive issue because of the sectarian political system in place. So that when people talk about decentralization, unfortunately, the conversation immediately goes towards you're talking about cantons that are based on sectarian divisions, the country is going to break apart, et cetera, et cetera. When, of course, centralization and decentralization need not be necessarily bad or good political systems. It's how you implement them that is the issue. And for decentralization to work, in any case, you need a strong center. In any case, so it doesn't mean that you have a weak center. It just means that you have a center that is delegating some of its powers to the locals. So unfortunately, in Lebanon, this remains a sensitive issue, which of course does not add to the solution.
Yes, thank you. Yusuf, I was about to you.
Yeah, regarding civil society. So it depends on which civil society we're talking about. And because in Tunisia, there are thousands of NGOs. When we talk about civil society, we're talking about tens of thousands of groups. But that doesn't mean that all of them are very active or all of them, again, are representative. Many of these groups are just a handful of people who they have a title as NGO, but in fact they don't have that many activities or they don't have that much influence on the ground. So this is issue number one. Now, many of them are actually quite active and they should play a role, but their role is not that influential when compared to the big forces in the country, such as the army and the police, Ennahda party, and UGTT, the labor union, and UTICA, the union of business leaders. These two, the last two, the UGTT and UTICA, could be considered civil society, but here we're talking more about other groups in civil society. And therefore, their size is not like these ones, and they cannot have as much influence. However, they could play an important role if they sit together and have some form of consortium, conglomeration. And sometimes actually these NGOs, they sign joint communiques together and they do actions together, but it is still very limited. But I think today, with the current crisis of legitimacy, with the current threats to the future of democracy in Tunisia, I think they could do more, but I don't see them yet taking a front seat or at least sitting together and acting as the representatives of civil society as a whole. They are still very divided, and we still see these other players actually being more active. And currently, we see the big players not able to enter into dialogue because actually the big players are not represented. They don't have representation among the youth, while these NGOs that I'm talking about are actually much more closer to the younger population, to the younger generation that is actually in the street and that is actually moving the streets. But again, this is not happening yet, but they need to sit together, have a consortium together, and bring the voice of civil society to the table.
Yes, thank you. Once again, I think there are a lot of bigger questions here that kind of once again highlight how all of this is interconnected, and something that I think it will be very interesting to look at someone in the audience also point out is sort of a wider regional and international dimension of this as well, because something that became clear on the 10-year anniversary of the Arab uprisings is that protest movement in different countries across the region were kind of learning from each other, and then we're learning from the experiences of the previous decade. But this is also something the international powers and international institutions did as well. There are some clear shifts in behavior, but at the same time, there are patterns that are being repeated. So Lina, I was wondering whether this is something that you can comment on. Do you think that today it is a matter of national powers very much focusing on sort of control their international instability, like their national instability, or are there like wider dynamics going on across the region in terms of sort of trying to address this? And then there is a question regarding to this, and specifically regarding resources for Linda, because Algeria obviously is a massive producer of gas. And gas prices are rising, right? So is this something that will allow the government to sort of buy out parts of the population as well, to sort of like stifle what's happening? Or do you think that we are beyond that point in that sense? And Youssef, there's also a question about Tunisia, and specifically the fact that there was a lot of international support for Tunisian democracy, and Tunisia was hailed as one of the positive examples coming out of the uprisings. What has changed? What is the situation in that regards today?
Okay, I'll start on the international dimension, which I'm glad has come up, because obviously these problems, and again, here I'm focusing on Lebanon, are not limited to just the domestic situation. So as I mentioned before, you have regional actors like Iran that are playing a very hands-on role in Lebanon through the support for Hezbollah. The Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad has recently started to also increase the extent of its influence in Lebanon after a period in which this influence somehow lessened. And this is because of the bigger geopolitical picture in Lebanon that is linked, not just in Lebanon, in the Levant in general, that is linked to US foreign policy and the relative disengagement of the US, not just from the Levant, but actually from the Middle East at large in general. So when you have US foreign policy basically disengaging, the regional actors find an opportunity to increase the extent of their influence. At the same time, Iran is having very few rivals regionally now. I mean, in the past, people always talked about the Iranian-Saudi rivalry and how it played out in a place like Lebanon. I would say this is no longer the case, because Saudi Arabia has pretty much, I would say, given up on its allies in Lebanon, like Saad al-Hariri, who used to be the prime minister, and his party used to be funded quite significantly by Saudi Arabia. This is not the case anymore. And so Saudi Arabia and other Gulf actors have actually more important things to worry about, such as the security and economic situation in the Gulf. And so their attention is very much turning to their immediate geography, abandoning the kind of broad Middle East ambitions that they used to have. Iran, on the other hand, is the opposite. It's seeing in this dynamic, as I said, an opportunity and also capitalizing on US disengagement. And in all that, regimes like Bashar al-Assad, which is right now not regarded as legitimate internationally by, the majority of the international community, is counting on fatigue within the international community, as well as Gulf Arab states in particular and other Arab states in general, so that it would be let into the international system once more as the de facto ruler of Syria and the de facto winner of the conflict. This is basically what Bashar al-Assad is hoping would happen. So all this, of course, plays out in a country like Lebanon, where actually there is no sovereignty. I mean, Lebanon is not a country that has any degree of sovereignty. The political parties sadly have their kind of backing elsewhere. And as I said, when the backing elsewhere goes, this directly influences the resources they have inside. And sadly, again, we go back to how this is part of the design of the political system that is based on sectarian representation, which fosters clientelism. And so again, I wrote about this in an article last year in the Guardian newspaper in the aftermath of the Beirut explosion in the port, to say, just like the ruling political actors in Lebanon treat their constituents as clients, they also position themselves as clients vis-a-vis international actors outside. So I think the two are very much intimately linked.
All right, and then over to the Algerian case and the question of buying the population with gas prices. It is possible that this could work, or will happen in the short term. But what I want to underline is that, a little bit like neighboring Tunisia, the economic crisis in Algeria is very serious. So I'm not sure that the rising gas prices will be enough to take care of all the other factors at play. There is a risk for a currency crisis, for example, in Algeria. The Algerian dinar has just kept on falling. It's now as low as 130 to 37 to the dollar. And it's rather a question of Algeria might need to demand a loan from the IMF. And just as in neighboring Tunisia, this is a sensitive question that could lead to tensions. If a currency crisis was to happen, well, then Algeria won't have any food security anymore. And there's already a question of actually since spring this year of severe water rationing in Algeria due to an ongoing water crisis. And food prices are rising a lot faster than wages are. And Algeria was quite recently, I think, by the UN, degraded from an upper middle income stage to a lower middle income. So even if they were able to buy off the population for a little bit, there are still all these enormous challenges that hover over the society. And there's the question of political legitimacy that subsidies can only buy for so long time, basically.
And I'll respond regarding the international aid to Tunisia. And I think the question was mostly about European aid. And frankly, be it in Europe or in Tunisia or myself and others, we like EU bashing. We're often complaining about the EU and saying that the EU is not doing enough or that the EU is doing too much. Also, it's true that in the case of Tunisia, at least, there is often some arrogance by some European diplomats when they go to Tunisians, sometimes in official meetings or in public meetings, saying, well, you're one of the largest recipients of EU aid in the Southern Mediterranean, and we need to know where our money is going, and you have to do this and you have to do that, and so on. So this happens, this exists. But we need to recognize that the EU is actually giving a lot of money to Tunisia, and that there is a lot of EU aid, and not just EU, EU, US, G7 countries, sent billions of dollars to Tunisia in different programs, many of them related to democracy building. The question where that money went, well, some of it was widely used or wisely used. We can see a number of things that developed in Tunisia in the last 10 years, from a lot of free press, a lot of institutions that are now on standby, but a lot of institutions that contributed to the democratization of the country. We've seen elections taking place, and some of the money that was spent on these elections by the Electoral Commission and so on was actually EU money. And that's public. This is not the secret EU channels or something like that. So EU money actually did serve some of its goals. But also, and this is not just about Tunisia or the MENA region, but this is the main argument or the main problem with development aid. Look at what happened in Afghanistan. Look at all these trillions that were spent, and then look at the results. So sometimes, not sometimes, but I think at some point we need to review how development aid is spent, and because actually sometimes the money is spent because be spent. So very often a lot of money ends up being spent in projects that lead nowhere, or that are a duplication of other projects, and so on and so on. So, I mean, just to say that it's wrong to put all the blame on the EU, or to be very critical or entirely critical of the EU. EU money did some of its results, but many of these projects led to nowhere. If I had to answer one question about this, where that money, what that led to, I would say that contributed in the freedom of expression and in the democratic life that exists in Tunisia. But of course, it's limited. And I think here the most important part of the job is on the Tunisians themselves, more than on the money coming from the EU. It's Tunisians who need to find ways to develop their democracy and protect their democracy, or make their democracy suitable to their needs.
Yes, thank you. And this is also a conversation that is going to be ongoing. There is obviously growing international criticism, but yet this remains a reality in a lot of places, not just in the region as well. So I think it's going to be something that we come back to over and over again for sure. We are in the last 15 minutes, so I think that this next round of questions is probably going to be the last one. I'm going to start straight back with you, Youssef. There is a question about whether you can delve a bit more into the dynamics of the big players in the country, specifically on the Tunisian General Labour Union and the Tunisian Confederation of Industry, Trade and Handicraft. What's their status in terms of popular legitimacy, and what about more traditional political parties, especially the Nada post-Ghannouchi? And for Linda, I kind of wonder whether you can say something about whether or not what we're seeing in Algeria now is a case of resilient authoritarianism, and if so, where do we go from there? And for Lina, a more general question about COVID-19 and the impact that the pandemic has had on the region and on Lebanon in particular, if you want. Is this something that has brought new issues to the fore, or rather has it been a case of it showcasing even more structural problems that were already there? Because then there's also a bigger dimension about vaccine diplomacy, right? And regional powers such as the UAE, for example, choosing to support other countries, or some countries over the others, and so on. So we have 12 minutes. So we will start with Youssef, and then we'll go to Linda and then Lina.
So with regards to, actually these are the three main non-armed players in the country: UGTT, the labor union; UTICA, the Confederation of Business Leaders, and another party. Apart from these, you have either very small political parties or very small NGOs and associations. When it comes to UGTT, its members are actually those who work in the public sector. So we're talking about a little less than 1 million people in general. It's the largest group in the country that is affiliated to one institution. Not a political party; it's a union, but they're affiliated. There are some disagreements, but they are there, and it's there. And UGTT has. It's not just a union, but it has a political voice. So it's often described as the other political party in the country because they act sometimes like a political party. They have ministers in government, or they back ministers in government, etc., etc. The issue, and I think one of the questions was related to the post-Abbasi, who was the former Secretary General of UGTT. So during the time of Abbasi, the former Secretary General, the UGTT was more or less united and was actually much stronger than it is today. With the current leadership of UGTT, there are a lot of divisions inside it compared to where it was before, and there is a leadership crisis inside it. So, although it is still a unified group, that there is no dissension or big dissension inside it, it's much weaker than where it was 6 years ago or 7 years ago. UGTT is it has these problems, but it is still an influential group. Utica, and so therefore it's influential among hundreds of thousands of people. Utica is definitely not a popular organization. It's the organization of the business leaders, and and leaders or bosses are not usually very popular. So it doesn't have a lot of popularity, but it has a legitimacy among its affiliates, and its affiliates control the economy of the country. So the Utica has influence when it comes to the economy and to money in the country in general. And therefore, Utica can have a word in politics. But again, also, under the new leadership, has its own problems. It's much weaker than where it was 6 years ago. And therefore, neither Utica nor UGTT are playing a very prominent role now as the country is going through this crisis. The third group, another party, which is the most structured party in the country, is also facing a leadership crisis with Ghannouchi, the leader of Ennahda, who's getting older and who doesn't want to leave or resign, even though a lot of people are calling on him to resign. And therefore, we see a lot of resignations inside Ennahda, much more than ever. And the party is actually facing its most serious crisis ever. And again, here we see another party, like all Tunisian political parties, and actually like most political regimes in the MENA region, being stuck to one man, and that man doesn't want to leave. And we see a big crisis inside the party today. And therefore, Ennahda, as a political party, is itself not able to have a constructive role in the current circumstances, and is actually being marginalized. Having said that, with the president now being unable to move forward very quickly, with more and more disenchantment in the street, and it's not yet fully there, but it's coming. We see UGTT taking a more proactive role in criticizing the president. We see Ennahda being able to stage larger demonstrations in the street. And I think this is, if there is no repression, if there are no major catastrophe in the country, I think this will lead us slowly towards the path of dialogue.
Great. And then Linda and Lina, if you could keep it to a couple of minutes each so that we can finish on time, even though there is so much to be said, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yes, of course. And thank you for the question. Algeria is definitely a case of resilient authoritarianism. And it's based on 4 pillars. The first one, I'd say, is a pseudo-democratic system, or more of a form of electoral authoritarianism. So basically, the state holds elections now, multi-party elections. But I mean, this is simply a democratic facade, the sort of showing that, sure, you can come and vote, get a representative, but in the end, the election is always rigged. So therefore, pseudo-democratic. The second pillar is redistributive patronage, which we've discussed, subsidies. So, for example, in May 2011, in the end of the Arab Spring, the government decided to increase public spending with 25%. So really thinking that they are, some Gulf monarchy state almost in the spending. They can't afford it, but still. And the third pillar is an effective use of the security apparatus. So basically, as mentioned, the military is big and important in Algeria. And as long as there is black oil money flooding in to support it, well, they will repress people as long as they are paid, if the masses are not too big, of course. And then I'll end with international support networks is also something that's very important for the authoritarianism in Algeria. So on the one hand, you have all the big oil and gas clients in Europe, Italy, France, Spain, but also the UK and the Netherlands. who are major clients of Algerian hydrocarbons. They don't really want to see, the system change because of this. And you also have, very important, Algeria has branded itself as a champion in the war against terror, because they had their experiences during the civil war, as mentioned in the 90s. So due to that, they have gotten a really close ally in the US. So basically, for authoritarianism to go, well, these 4 obstacles have to go. Thank you.
Okay, briefly on COVID-19 and the many ways in which it's been actually instrumentalized. So we talked about equalities and inequalities and lack of social safeness, in the sense that not all countries were able to deliver to their citizens because they didn't necessarily have the necessary infrastructure. That's one issue that increased inequalities, of course. Then you have the issue of vaccine diplomacy that you raised, Lucia, mainly China, using this as an opportunity to increase its economic influence in the region, teaming up with countries like UAE to set up factories to manufacture the Chinese, one of the Chinese vaccines at least, in UAE to be marketed under an Arabic name. And also, of course, countries trying to increase their economic trade relationships with China in order to be able to acquire that vaccine. But then you have situations like Lebanon, in which different political parties were granted different contracts by the government to import different kinds of vaccines to the country. So some were granted a contract for the Chinese vaccines, some Russian vaccines, some other vaccines. So here we have, once again, political parties in Lebanon using the vaccine as the latest form of rent in the country. And not only that, they also instrumentalized the COVID crisis, because curfews that have been implemented were also very convenient for preventing people from mobilizing in the street. So the movement that Lebanon had seen of street protests was largely quelled using the excuse of COVID-19 curfews in Lebanon. So here we have, a crisis that has sadly proven to be rather beneficial, I think, for the ruling elites in more ways than one.
Yes, thank you. And I guess to conclude on that point, this is also something that it's still very much unfolding and developing. So this is also something that I don't think we have seen the long-term effects that this is going to have on not only on the region as a whole, but especially in specific cases like the ones that you have been talking about today. And I think, just to wrap it up, something that is really stuck with me throughout all of the conversation today is that you are portraying a picture of different societies that are either already at the tipping point, some of these have passed the tipping point some time ago, or are very rapidly approaching it. So this is also something that I think we will continue to discuss, and I very much look forward to continuing this conversation in another installment of this, because it's very close to Europe, and it's also something that cuts across so many different themes. So I want to thank all of you for the conversation today. I really wish it could have been going on for longer, and also to the audience for sending in these very interesting questions. We didn't get to cover all of them, but I tried as much as possible to strike a balance there. And for everyone who's listening in, if you follow us on social media, we are on all the usual platforms. You will also see updates on the conversation today. We will put a recording up on all of our platforms, and you will also get notified of upcoming events as well. So once again, thank you, everyone. Thank you to all our speakers. Today has been a very interesting conversation, and I look forward to continuing it.